Welcome back to Combat Mission, where we're going to take a look at the German Panther tank. A little historical background, its vital characteristics and variants in Combat Mission, and its tactical usage, how to get the most out of it. If you've any interest in the European theatre of World War II, then you've probably already heard of the Panther. It's one of the famous German big cats, along with the Tiger, and there is an awful lot of material out there on it already that goes into more depth than I can reasonably do in a pretty short video. So what I'm going to be focusing on here is Panther from a combat mission perspective, which throws a slightly different light on the vehicle and makes it look a lot better than it was. But I'll get to that. One quick note here is that I currently don't have Combat Mission Red Thunder installed, so I'm coming at the Panther in this video from a Western Front perspective. It's obviously the same tank as was used on the Eastern Front, and everything should still be relevant, but unfortunately there isn't going to be any footage of the Soviets. The Panther's design was a reaction to the Soviet T-34 and KV-1s the German army encountered when it invaded Russia in 1941. While the Panzer IIIs and IVs that made up the bulk of the German designs in the Panzerarm could manage through an imbalance in tactical competence and variance with improved main guns, the German army decided that what it really needed was another tank. A new design could incorporate a lot of the experience the Germans had gained in armoured warfare over the last few years, as well as exploiting some of the more impressive features of the T-34, and hopefully totally replace the Panzer IIIs and IVs, because obviously running a single tank design streamlines your supply, manufacturing and training an awful lot. This streamlining didn't quite happen. While the Panzer III dropped out of service as the Panther came in, the Panzer IV stayed in service until the end of the war. But the eventual design for the Panzer V Panther was an excellent balance of characteristics. All tank designs are a mix of firepower, protection and mobility, with certain characteristics emphasized at the cost of others depending on the tank's role. So, for example, light tanks gain mobility by sacrificing protection, while heavy tanks gain protection by sacrificing mobility. The Panther found a kind of sweet spot. It had an excellent gun, very good frontal armour and a high power to weight ratio that made it very mobile. Of course it had to make some trade-offs to achieve this balance, but they turned out to be acceptable, and to some extent the Panther defies classification as medium or heavy and is instead arguably the forerunner to today's main battle tank concept. So the Germans have got their design, and by January 1943 the first Panzer units are having their shiny new tanks delivered. From April till May 1943, or thereabouts, all the Panthers they get delivered are sent back to the factories because they have a long list of teething problems. The most spectacular of which involves fuel leakage in the engine compartment, setting the tank on fire. Unfortunately for the Germans, while the Panther ticks all the boxes of that archetypal firepower, protection, mobility trinity, tank design also involves balancing other admittedly less exciting characteristics like reliability, strategic mobility, and ease of maintenance and production. Technical problems are the bane of the Panther's existence, mostly due to a combination of over-engineering and a rush to get the tank into production. It first sees action at the Battle of Kursk in 1943, where, despite showing promise, its impact is muted by the sheer scale of the battle, the fact that the Soviets have had 2 extra months to dig in while the Germans wait for the Panthers to turn up, and because the Trews have lost significant training time to maintenance issues. The design was still good though, and the first variant, the Panther D, was rapidly iterated on. Incorporating a number of improvements, the Panther A started production in August 1943, and a further development in the shape of the Panther G entered production in March 1944. Reliability improves, but as the war goes on, these improvements are counterbalanced by the increasingly difficult position that Germany finds itself in. Armour quality degrades as supplies of alloying metals are cut or run dry, the use of slave labour results in poor quality and potential sabotage, decreasing fuel supplies restrict training time, and with the Germans losing ground on the defensive, Panthers that are knocked out or disabled in battle are lost without the prospect of repair, salvage, or even looting for spare parts. Again, This isn't to say that the Panther isn't an effective tank. Even by the end of the war, it's still a formidable opponent that outcompetes Sherman 75s and 76s, as well as T-34-85s in firepower and frontal protection. And this is the Panther that makes it into Combat Mission. When you select a Panther in the Force Selector, or you have it assigned to your force in a scenario or campaign, you get the paper Panther, you get the Panther design. You get the gun, the armor, and the mobility. Battles in Combat Mission take place outside of any greater context. When you bring a Combat Mission Panther to the fight, it always actually gets there. It's not sat on the side of the road behind the lines waiting to be literally disassembled so the transmission can be replaced. So because of the artificial circumstances of a Combat Mission game, the weaknesses that stopped the historical Panther from exerting the impact its design mandated don't really apply. So let's talk about the Panther's trinity. There are several variants spread across the different Combat Mission titles, but they all share basically the same major characteristics. The Panther's main gun is the 7.5cm Kampfwagenkanone 42L/70, or very roughly, if you're not German, the 75mm fighting vehicle cannon of 1942 with a length of 70 calibers. It's easy to focus purely on caliber when thinking about guns. Bigger is better, right? But of course it's a little more complicated than that. The Sherman, as a totally non-random example, also has a 75mm gun, but because the Panther's 75 is longer and the shells have a greater propellant charge, the Panther's shells have about half again as much muzzle velocity as the Sherman's. In practical terms, this translates into greater penetration, because the outgoing round has more force behind it, and a flatter trajectory that makes it easier to aim. The upshot is that the Panther can easily penetrate the frontal armour of a Sherman out to 1,000 meters. The tricky part about engaging at this kind of distance is that the fire control system for the Panther consists of a telescopic sight, the gunner's eyeball, and his ability to judge rain and correct himself onto the target. The chances of getting a first round hit is pretty low, providing you can actually spot a target to begin with, but the Panther will kill most allied tanks out to the whole kilometre, and probably beyond, providing you can actually spot them, and they're oblivious enough to hang around while 75mm shells keep getting closer and closer. The exact types of ammunition carried aren't specified, the game just notes armour piercing and high explosive. The exact ammo count varies a tiny bit between variants, but it's around 80 rounds with a 50-50 split between AP and HE. In terms of rate of fire, the main gun can get about 8 rounds off a minute. This is fast enough to splurge your entire HE load of 40-ish rounds in 5 turns, which is something to be aware of if you're area firing a lot. Rounding out the armament, we have a pair of MG34 machine guns, one in the hull and one coaxially mounted with the main gun, and these have a total of 5,000 rounds. Later variants have another minor weapon tucked away, but I'll deal with that when we get to those variants. Finally, with regards to firepower, it's worth pointing out that the Panther doesn't have a fantastically quick turret traverse speed. It takes the first model, the Panther D, about a minute to do the whole 360-degree turn, which is an excruciatingly long time if you get clever girled. Later models get faster, but it's still a heavy and poorly balanced turret. Next up, we have the armor protection. The Panther's frontal armor actually provides more protection than the frontal armor of the Tiger, thanks to the slope, which not only increases the effective thickness of the armor, but also encourages incoming rounds to ricochet off. It is effectively proof against Sherman 75s and 57mm AT guns from the front. There is an interesting exception to this, though it's so difficult to pull off, it's kind of the exception that proves the rule. This is where I have to make a slight alteration to the script, because this exception, which I was not expecting to see because it's so unlikely, immediately happened when I was getting the footage. You may have noticed that despite all of the shots bouncing relatively harmlessly off the front of the Panther here, the crew have decided that they would rather be outside. This is because the judiciously cut second hit found the Panther's shot trap. So tracing the hit decals, we can see that the incoming Sherman 75mm AP shell here has ricocheted off the weapon mount into the lower curve of the gun mantlet, and then ricocheted off this to hit the top of the hull just beside the driver's hatch. It hasn't hit with enough force to penetrate, though this could easily happen if the shell hadn't lost energy by bouncing twice, but it has struck the armour hard enough to produce spalling. This is a very rare occurrence, and I have a feeling it's happened here because I'm firing on the Panther from close range and it's slightly elevated, changing the angles of incoming shots. Like I said, it's kind of the exception that proves how good the Panther's frontal armour is, because while it's not impossible, it requires enemy fire to come in at a very narrow and very specific angle, so it's not something to worry about. Instead, what you should be worried about is system degradation. I always go on about this with tanks. Just because incoming fire is not actually getting through the armour doesn't mean it's not having any effect. External systems of all kinds, from optics to radios to the main gun, can all be knocked out without the tank suffering a single penetration. So just because you can shrug off enemy fire doesn't mean it's a good idea. More powerful anti-tank guns, for example the 76mm gun on the Sherman, the 17-pounder on the British Firefly, and the 3-inch gun on the M10, are capable of getting through that frontal armour at short ranges or if they find a weak point. Penetrations aren't always consistent, especially at distance, but the frontal armour is by no means impervious against these kinds of weapons as it is against the Humvee 75. The sides and rear armour are a completely different story. Here, the armour protection is significantly weaker. Sherman 75's 57mm AT guns and infantry anti-tank weapons like the bazooka and Piat have no problems getting penetrations in the turret or hull from these angles. The Panther also has some side skirts covering the gap between the hull overhang and the tracks. These are pretty small, but they do give that little bit of extra protection against anti-tank fire and shaped charge warheads. And in case you're wondering what the funny texture on the armour is, it's an anti-magnetic mine paste called Zimmerit, which has absolutely no function whatsoever in combat mission. Our final core characteristic is mobility. The Panther can do about 450 to 500 meters at maximum speed on the flat off-road in a single turn. It has these nice wide tracks that keep its ground pressure low, making it in theory less likely to get bogged by tanks with narrower tracks. I haven't actually tested this because seriously it's just asking for trouble. If you're relying on being able to get through the mud without being bogged, chances are you're either in a position where you have to risk it anyway, or you need to come up with a different plan. Rounding the details for the tank out, the Panther has a crew of 5, tank commander in the left rear of the turret beneath the cupola, who is easily identifiable by his "shoot me I'm important" hat, gunner just ahead of the commander on the left of the main gun, or behind this hole for the main gun optic, a loader on the other side of the turret, driver in the front left of the hull, behind this little rectangular plate that opens up to give him a good view when the tank is not in combat, and last but not least, the bow gunner / radio operator on the right side of the hull behind, funnily enough, the hull machine gun. In Final Blitzkrieg and Red Thunder, you can also load the Panther up with infantry. A total of 15 can ride on the engine deck, which can be handy in non-combat situations. They have no protection whatsoever, and do not provide any extra armour protection for the Panther, so it's best to kick them off and make them walk before the shooting starts. Though keeping something like an expendable scout team with the Panther for extra spotting ability and some limited insurance against nasty surprises isn't a terrible idea if the tank isn't actually being engaged. This brings us on to the Panther's variants. There are 3 main models, D, A and G in that order. Don't ask me why it's not alphabetical, because I have no idea. And each of these main models has incremental changes as well. So we have the D late, and then early, mid and late versions of the Panther A and G. These variants drift in and out of availability over time, and combined with different size production runs and different allocations between Army and SS, the rarity cost of different Panther types can vary significantly from month to month and from subfaction to subfaction. Luckily there is some constancy here, and all the variants are between 357 and 365 points in the force selector with standard values, i.e. regular with no modifiers. It's quite interesting on its own to go through the different variants, not only so you can identify them and do some force selection backplotting if you do bump into them and you're into that kind of thing, but also because it shows the incremental design alterations that the Germans are making as time goes on. Starting things off, we have the Panther D Late. This is easily identifiable from the drum cupola, the letterbox MG, and behind the scenes it has a total ammo capacity of 79 rounds. After this comes the Panther A Early, which as a different type has quite a few changes. Most obviously the cupola has changed. The drum cupola proved to be quite vulnerable to enemy fire, so it's been replaced by a better protected, rounded off version. When he's opened up, the tank commander is a little less exposed too. His shoulders are behind some armour now, so he's a tiny bit less vulnerable. Also up on the turret, the loader now has a periscope, so spotting is theoretically slightly better. In terms of non-visual changes, the turret front has an extra 10mm of armour, which is nice, and the turret traverse has improved a little, also nice, but the glacis armour is no longer face hardened, which is not nice. In extremely simple terms, because I am not really up on my metalworking, something like an armour plate can be treated to harden it. This makes it stronger, but it also makes it more brittle. So hardened armour is good because you can get more protection for the same weight, but the cost is that if you smack it hard enough, it will simply shatter. One way of getting the best of both worlds is to only harden the face of an armour plate, hence face hardening. This gives the metal a kind of hard outer crust which increases protection, while the softer metal of the plate body is better able to absorb certain shocks and stops the crust from shattering. So in short, from here on out, this isn't happening for the Panther's front slope, and the variants that follow will have slightly less effective armour here. Moving on to the Panther A Mid, we get a couple of other major changes. Most obviously, we've gotten rid of the weird letterbox mount for the Hull MG and replaced it with a ball mount, giving the bow gunner / radio man some of that cool traverse thing for when he's aiming. Slightly less obviously, but still a visual change, the gunner's optic is now monocular instead of binocular. Not that I think it makes any practical difference here. Behind the scenes though, the turret traverse rate has decreased slightly because it is now governed by the engine RPM. I don't really know the details behind this one, though it sounds like a visit from the Good Idea Fairy, so the practical takeaway from this is that the turret traverse is now a little bit slower, but still better than the Panther D. The engine has also had a governor fitted as well, so about 90 horsepower and 9 km per hour have been shaved off the top speed, and it's a tiny bit slower. The Panther A Late gets some new optics for the gunner. The indentation for the old binocular style optic has been deleted and there's just a hole for the single scope, but more excitingly, this variant gets a fancy new weapon. This is the Nahverteidigungswaffe, which very roughly translates to close-in defense weapon. This is mounted in the turret, behind the loader's periscope, and it's basically a short-range grenade launcher for blowing up enemy infantry trying to do nasty things to the tank. If you haven't screwed up so badly that enemy infantry are crawling all over your Panther, then you'll be pleased to know that the Nahverteidigungswaffe can also launch smoke grenades, so from the Panther A Late onwards, you can pop smoke. It only fires a single smoke grenade at a time, so we're not talking about an instant smoke screen here like you get with modern smoke discharges, but it's better than nothing. That is the final Panther A variant. Next up we have the Panther G Early. This is different enough to get a new letter because it has a slightly redesigned hull, not that you can really tell by looking. Externally, the armour thickness of the upper sides, hull top and nose have been increased slightly. This sounds good, but it's balanced out by the fact that at this stage in the war, Germany is losing access to things like molybdenum and manganese, which are needed in armour manufacturing to increase shock resistance, as well as generally suffering a decline in manufacturing quality due to labour shortages, the use of slave labour and Allied bombing. So although there is a little bit more armour on the Panther G, the armour as a whole is lower quality and has a greater chance of fracturing or cracking when struck by things like 76mm or 17-pounder armour piercing rounds. The hull also features different hatches for the driver and radio operator. These are now hinged instead of swing hatches, so they have these very obvious hinges, and the driver now has a single swiveling periscope instead of two fixed scopes. These changes don't make any practical difference, as far as I can tell, but they do make the Panther G Early easy to recognise. Internally, there is space for another 3 rounds of main gun ammunition, bringing the total capacity to 82. The Panther G Mid has only a couple of minor differences. The internal ammunition bins for the main gun are now armoured, so in theory the tank is less prone to ammunition detonations. In practice, any penetration at all is bad news, so reducing the post-penetration effects is less of a big deal than it sounds. Unless you're the tank crew, and you might appreciate being able to leave your tank at your own pace instead of being forced to bail out at extremely high speed. The second difference is that Germany is running out of rubber for the road wheels, and these are now steel rimmed, so you can tell this variant apart from the lack of black rubber around the edges of the road wheels. Again, this has no practical battlefield effect, it just makes it easier to identify this particular variant. Finally, we have the Panther G Late. This has a redesigned gun mantlet with a very obvious chin that's there to remove the shot trap I mentioned earlier, where incoming rounds could bounce off the mantlet into the hull. We're back with rubber rimmed road wheels, I don't know why, and there are new exhaust mufflers. I don't know if this is the final Panther variant. It's not impossible that there is a Panther G Latest that we'll see in the end of the war modules for Red Thunder and Final Blitzkrieg. There isn't one in Fortress Italy's final module, but the Italian front is something of a peripheral problem for the Germans in 1945, and I can't really see them sending brand new Panther models to northern Italy when the Soviets are pretty close to the factory. Of all these variants, they're all very comparable, and the way I would pick and choose between them in the Force Selector is to go with the standard rarity model for whatever month I'm fighting in, saving those rarity points for something more exciting. That is the Panther in its many forms in Combat Mission. How do you get the most out of it? Well, we want to maximise the Panther's advantages in frontal armour and gun power while minimising its disadvantage in side armour. So simply put, front towards the enemy, good field of fire, flanks covered. In terms of role, they are very good at engaging allied armour, being able to reliably punish enemy tanks while being able to shrug off most incoming fire. The tank duel or anti-armour battle is frequently the backbone of any given combat mission game, and the victor gains the freedom to bring his tanks out into the open where they can crush enemy infantry without much fear of reprisal. So winning the armour fight is paramount, and with careful handling, the Panther is extremely good for this. I should also mention that it functions well in the anti-infantry role too. It still has 2 machine guns and 40 rounds of high explosive, but the anti-tank role is where it really shines. The main downside to the Panther is the cost. At around 360 points, it's almost twice as expensive as a 190 point Sherman 75. The Panther is a good tank, but it can't be in 2 places at once, and it's a lot of capability and points wrapped up in a package that is vulnerable to bad luck. This is why careful handling is so important, and overconfidence is such a problem. Despite being a formidable piece of kit, you're not going to have that many of them, and it's important to keep them up and running. Just because the Panther can shrug off hits to the frontal armour doesn't mean you should sit there and take it. Every impact is going to not only degrade systems and decrease the effectiveness of the tank, but also roll the dice on whether something like the main gun or a track gets knocked out, at which point the Panther very quickly becomes less of a threat. In a similar vein, just because you can dominate the battlefield with that excellent 75mm gun doesn't mean you should keep to one good position. If the enemy knows where your Panther is, he can plan around it or start bringing in artillery and air power, so keeping the Panther out of sight until you need it is a solid policy. It can have a huge effect on the battlefield as a kind of tank in being when your opponent knows it's out there somewhere and then it needs to worry about it, but he doesn't know exactly where it is. Finally, as always, combined arms. Like all tanks, the Panther is vulnerable to enemy infantry sneaking up on its flanks, so if you're using dense terrain to shield your squishy side armour, be sure that you have some infantry in there as well to prevent any nasty shapes charge based surprises. Keeping enemy infantry away is a good policy in general because it means you can open up in relative safety and the tank commander can get a much better view of what's going on without the risk of sudden trepanning. Of course, this is pretty standard tank stuff that you should be doing with pretty much any tank, and it says a lot about the idea of the Panther being the forerunner of the main battle tank concept, that it doesn't really need any special considerations in the same way as the more niche tank roles that cropped up in World War II. So, There we have the Panther, always my go-to tank choice if I'm playing as the Germans. It's a fantastic piece of kit, with the added bonus that it doesn't suffer from its historical weaknesses in game. Hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.